Good morning, Father Hawley. On this, I don't even know what day it is anymore. Can you tell me, Father Hawley, what is the sermon about today?
So we're going to talk about how our spiritual growth is tied to holy order, how our habits, our practices, and our means form us and our identity as human beings and as children of God. So we're going to talk about spiritual boot camp and the people in the wilderness and tie it all together and how we can get back to our spiritual habits that form us as a people. Cool? So that little gospel response is a new wrinkle in our liturgy. Nicely done, choir. Way to be bagging on that kind of stuff. So in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. So we're going to start out this morning with a little something called a jody. For those of you with an armed service background, you might recognize this term. Those of you that don't, a jody is a little bit of a ditty. A call and response to help keep people on cadence. So you hear ditties when people are marching or running together. Kind of the most famous one you can identify with is that count for your steps. The left, 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 you right, left. And you all would respond, left, 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 you right, left. Yeah, okay. So the fun part about jodies is that as you're doing them, you can use them as a tool to convey some sort of wisdom or instruction or humor. So I wrote a little jody this morning for our Deuteronomy reading. Oh, how I love the Old Testament. Rich and all different sorts of things. So I'm going to start jogging around, finding my pace. I'm going to do a little jody. When I call it out, you all respond. You all tracking? All right, here we go. Moses got some law for you. Moses got some law for you. Love your God and neighbor too. Love your God and neighbor too. Don't you kill and don't you cheat. Don't you kill and don't you cheat. None of that cloven-footed meat. None of that sound off, 1, 2, sound off, 3, 4, sound off, 8, 10. Man, I'm just stoked you all got cloven-footed meat. Nailed it, yes. What I'm trying to do with this little jody was connect this idea that our spiritual growth, that our spiritual identity is tied to holy order. What I mean by that is that our practices, our habits, the means in which we enact holy order, they form us as individuals and as a community. And I think our Deuteronomy reading highlights that connection today. We see that the habits that the Hebrews practiced in the wilderness would go on to define them when they actually entered into the Promised Land. Moses understood this point really well, almost to the point where he looked like a drill instructor in today's, reading. He's standing up there in front of all of his troops on the edge of the Promised Land, and he's looking at it. And he's saying, remember, there is but one God. Remember that you're not supposed to be making graven images. Remember to keep the Sabbath. I can almost hear him saying, remember, polish your boots. The folks, the Hebrew people, got kind of a bad rep as being a stiff-necked people. And I can really identify with the stiff-neckedness of the Hebrews because I hated polishing my boots. I did it last night to get ready for today, and it said a little bit better, but back in the day, Recruit Hawley was not all about polishing his boots. I remember thinking to myself, this is the most banal activity. It is a waste of time. I am smarter, better than sitting here polishing boots. I was almost to the point of being, kind of insubordinate about it. I thought I knew what the ends were. In combat, am I going to really run around and stop to buff out a place in my boots? The bullets are flying. Later on, Christian von Wepperfeld, I see you're wearing your boots. Yeah, you don't even polish your boots anymore. I mean, what was the story with that? So, in my mind, these means that they were trying to instill were useless. But as time went on, I recognized that the means do matter. Polishing your boots matters. Somewhere's Sergeant Helton is smiling right now. But this idea that the formation that we get in filling those little parts, those little scuffs in our boots, the time we take to polish them as brightly as we can, all the hard work where your forearms cramp from buffing them, that does something to a soldier. That does something to the formation of one's character. And in this case, it does something for a person's ability to pay attention to detail. It does something to help the mind single task. Polishing boots helps us to endure long stretches of sustained focus. And so, if you're in the middle of a firefight, polishing your boots isn't going to save you. But if you're in the middle of a 12-hour watch, and there's 1 minute of suspicious activity, if you have formed yourself in that attention to detail, that sustained focus, that can save the life of your friends and of yourself. The means matter. Our rules become practices, become habits, and they form us as a people. The Hebrew people knew this formation process to be especially powerful. When we pick up our Deuteronomy reading today, the people are getting that one last reminder from Moses of just how important the law is. Deuteronomy literally means second law. And so as a piece of literature, we have this collection of farewell addresses. Moses is standing on the edge of the promised land. He is looking out to the people, giving them one last reminder, because he can't go with them. Moses isn't allowed to go into the promised land, so he has to send them off on their own. And he wants to remind them that the commandments God gave them on Mount Horeb had become practices for them in the wilderness. And it was that these practices would eventually become holy habits for them in the Holy Land. The Decalogue, which is a fancy name for the Ten Commandments, it provided a holy order for the Hebrew people that set them apart from their neighbors, and it defined them as a nation. And yet, it's not like the Hebrew people were the first ones to come up with a divine social contract. Laws against killing, lying, and stealing, or laws about honoring your father or the local deity, those were not unique in the ancient Near East. While Moses was standing on the edge of the Promised Land, there was already a sophisticated set of legal statutes in place in Canaan. The Code of Hammurabi, which was over 300 rules, already existed in that land. And so the rule of law was not unique to the Hebrews, but the content of the law and the means in which they practiced those laws were remarkably different. And that unique holy order defined the Hebrew people over and against the Canaanites and the Philistines, and it saved their culture in the time of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So take the first commandment, for instance. Yahweh was the God, not a God. In that sense, Yahweh did not have geographical borders. God was close to the people no matter where they went, whether that's in exile or into the promised land. I love that part of the Deuteronomy reading today. Oh, surely all the peoples will know you as wise and discerning people because of how close your God is to you. In a worldview where different gods patronize different cities and peoples, the idea of a merciful God that can be appealed to in all places, in all times, in all situations was revelatory. And it still is today. And so in order to remind themselves that God was always with them, the Hebrew people had this yearly practice of the Feast of Booths. When every fall, they had to build and live in these temporary shelters to remind themselves of their refugee status and how God was with them all the days that they wandered through the wilderness. Part of me is flummoxed by imagining the kind of humility we could restore in our own nation if we had to travel to the coasts of New England or California or Florida or Texas every fall and live off the land for 7 days to remind ourselves that we too were once immigrants in a foreign land. And likewise, the practices that grew up around the Sabbath commandments defined the Hebrew people. The idea of a rule of rest was novel. And not just rest for the inside of the word, but rest for the land, rest for animals, rest for the resident aliens. In the ancient Near East, hospitality was a big deal. I mean, you were hospitable to anyone who came to your door. But this idea that you give rest to all those that were on your property in your household, that was unique. That was something never seen before. The fact that the one true God gave special attention to refugees and foreigners was remarkable in that day and age. And this commandment became concrete in the suspension of all commerce and work from sundown on what we know as Friday to sundown on what we know as Saturday. And again, in your own imaginations, see if you can picture what our city would be like if we were able to give everyone who dwells beside us a whole day off, 24 hours to recuperate, to replenish, to know the gift of goodness that is Sabbath. It's an amazing rule of law that is in our tradition. What I'm getting at in all this is that when the world seems especially chaotic and all of our ends seem obscured by partisan rhetoric and fake news, that the best course of action is to go back to the means of holy order that formed us as a tradition. A good example of this comes again from the Hebrew people. If you mosey on through the Hebrew Bible, you'll come to 2 Kings. In 2 Kings, after centuries of corrupt leaders and wayward policies of both kingdoms, suddenly under King Josiah, the scroll of the law was rediscovered. And that brought the kingdom of Judah back into almost a right relationship with God. And that scroll of the law, of no surprise, was this book of Deuteronomy. It was these farewell addresses from Moses that brought the people new life and new clarity. And so now, in a day and age when our world feels so chaotic and misguided, what we need is a healthy dose of holy order. Guided by Christ's way of love, we need to re-engage in some of our fundamental communal practices. Practices like reading scripture together. Practices like praying daily, fasting, giving alms, forgiving one another of our trespasses, and worshiping together in word and sacrament. Our fall focus this year is on spiritual growth. And part of spiritual growth is our willingness to be formed by holy order. Just as we have to polish our boots before we are ready to stand watch on the wall, so must we study Christ's way of love before we are ready to declare the year of the Lord's favor. So my challenge to you this day is to take up a spiritual boot polishing practice this week. Maybe it's to read a little more scripture. Maybe it's to get up in the morning and give yourselves 10 minutes to read the Gospel of Mark. Or better yet, to join in a community that studies scripture together. A week from Monday, Meryl's going to start a class on Ephesians at noon downstairs. A good time to come together with your brothers and sisters and to study scripture. If you're in that age bracket of 20s to 40s, Wednesday night in the youth center, you're going to be studying 1 Timothy. There's a Bible study here Tuesday nights. There are any number of ways to engage in scripture, to re-engage in that habit that formed us. Or maybe it's about giving alms. You could go and you could get one of those rolls of $1 coins and try for a week to give to everyone who asks of you. What would it be like to give alms to everyone who asks? Or if you wanted to do it in a time manner, what would it be like to volunteer your time with helping our neighbor, the homeless community, or signing up to work with Habitat for Humanity? Re-engaging in that practice of giving alms might refresh your spiritual growth. Or maybe if you're feeling really motivated, you could try fasting. Yes. This is a part of our tradition, a practice of our tradition that's kind of gone to the wayward. But we do it as a community every Ash Wednesday and every Good Friday. There's something about, maybe giving up at least meat on Fridays that brings us a little more clarity in our relationship to God and a little more solidarity with those who don't have enough to eat. Or lastly, what about just offering up a little more time for prayer? Is there a practice you could do this week where you take 10 minutes and add a quiet time to listen to God? Or better yet, the communal practice of gathering together at 6 o'clock every night over in the bell tower to offer up evening prayer of one another. So again, my challenge to you this week, pick one of these practices. Or come up with your own, but find something that's formational to our tradition and reapply it to your life. And in those efforts of faithfulness, you'll find that you grow closer to a God who is always faithful to us. In the Latin, that would be Semper Fidelis Deus. Or, for all you Marines out there, Semper Fi, Yahweh. Thanks be to God for being faithful to us always. And thanks be to God for a community to practice together. Amen.